Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Zarni. I'm going to be the TA for this course for this semester. And today, what I'm going to be doing is running through a practice presentation with you all so that you can kind of see what this would look like and what we're going to be expecting from you all at the end. So, overall, we're going to try to aim for about 10 to 15 minutes for the presentation. And the idea in previous classes when we were in person was that you had 15 minutes to present your presentation and answer questions. So however much time you spent presenting, you only had a certain amount of time to answer questions. It's going to be a little bit different. So again, aim for about 10 to 15 minutes for this presentation. Anyway, so what I'm going to be talking to you guys about today is a group of graduate students that sacrificed their PhD careers to turn in their PI for falsifying some data. This is an incredibly fascinating case, and I hope that you find it interesting. So starting off, I want to give you all a little bit of background about what was going on with this case. So this took place at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and it had to do with Professor Goodwin. So she worked there from 2000 to 2006. Just to get some more perspective on the University of Madison, or University of Wisconsin in Madison, it is a world-class biochemistry center. It's ranked among the top 5 biochemistry programs across the country and has an amazing graduate program. In addition, University of Wisconsin is a really, really big federal research institution, and they ranked second for federal research grants in 2008. So there's a lot of money coming into this department. There's a lot of really great science that's happening here, and it's very, very highly sought after. So Dr. Goodwin in her lab was actually studying the role of 3' UTRs in regulating gene expression during embryonic development in model organisms of C. elegans. And she really wanted to focus on sexual development and sexual determination. So if you all are aware, C. elegans have a hermaphroditic property to them until there is some need for exclusively male uh, sexual organs to develop, but for most of C. elegans, they exist as hermaphrodites. So it's a very interesting system to test and to explore what sexual development looks like. And overall, she had 6 graduate students in her lab. One thing I do want to point out is that she was a graduate student or did her postdoc with another researcher at University of Wisconsin or University of Madison, Wisconsin, and that professor was also doing very, very similar work. That'll come back and be important later, so mark that down for later. So overall, what motivated these students to turn in their professor? This is a really interesting case that the students in her lab actually decided to report her and tell someone what was going on. So some quotes from some of the people in the lab. There was one experiment that I had just not done, as well as several published and unpublished figures that seem to have been manipulated, he says. 2 images apparently identical to those already published were presented as unpublished and as representing proteins different from the published versions. I remember being overwhelmed and not being able to deal with it at that moment. That was from Garrett. So Garrett was one of the leading grad students that decided to go forward with this reporting. So to put some more context about what he was talking about, he had been working in the lab and had been doing some protein purifications and getting protein gels out of the different experiments that he was doing to test for expression and other stuff like that. And what came of this was that he read through a grant proposal that Goodwin had submitted and found one of his gels in there that was exactly the same gel that he had had previously, but it was labeled with a different protein. Um, and he was a little bit freaked out by this. He was like, "That's not correct. That is not the data that I gave you." And then, also within the grant, there was other experiments that Goodwin put in there that she said she had preliminary data for that were completely fabricated. There was no one in the lab that had done those experiments. The lab wasn't even set up to do those experiments. So the students got a huge red flag when they saw that grant go through. Um, and then from another student in the lab, my biggest worry was that what if we didn't turn her in and different grad students got stuck in our position? So, really looking forward to the future of this lab. And like I said, Goodwin was a relatively new PI. So she started in 2000 and was only there till 2006. So she only had about 6 years under her belt for her lab in total. So, this is unfortunately, the students felt like they needed to protect the integrity of the lab moving forward. So the students decided to come together and take action. So in late December of 2005, Goodwin students brought the matter to the university. And then the really interesting thing is when Goodwin was questioned about this by the ethics committee at University of Wisconsin, her story changed a ton. So at one point, she said that it had been placeholders for future data that she thought was going to come in, and oops, forgot to change it out when she actually submitted the grant. So it was bad editing on her part. She looked at some of the other experiments that they were saying were made up, and she was like, oh, this is an idea that I've been having, and this is some hypothetical data. I forgot to put that it was hypothetical, and not that this was real data. And then, among a bunch of other things, came out of that. And then, because of all these story changes, a formal investigation was launched in February, and it found two additional grants that she had submitted that contained fraudulent data. So it wasn't just this one that the students were really worried about. This set a precedent for her faking data in her grant proposals. So in late February, she ended up resigning. So over the 3 years, $1.8 million in federal funds had been canceled. So those were all of her grants that she had collected. So almost $2 million in grant money had gone to Dr. Goodwin and was now just gone. And Goodwin agreed to pay $500,000 in restitution to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, as well as to voluntarily, as a voluntary exclusion from federal research for 3 years. So really, she got $2 million out of this, but only had to pay back $500,000 because of the manipulations that she had done. And as you'll see later, this exclusion from federal research ended up not even being a worry for her because she pivoted away from academia and ended up going down the path of industry. So one of the saddest things to come out of this is what happened to her graduate students. So Goodwin, like I said, now works in private industry and is getting paid actually a lot more than she would have as a PI, which, there's a whole lot of issues with that. But 3 of the 6 students that she had ended up quitting grad school entirely. They did not feel supported by their department or the university to keep going, and they decided that it was better just to get out at that point. 2 of her students ended up starting over with new professors, and had to start their PhDs all over again. So I believe they were in their second or third year. So basically had to extend their PhDs to 8 to 9 years, which is an incredibly long amount of time to be spending in graduate school. And then one of them quit science altogether. She was so upset with everything that had happened and just couldn't deal with it anymore. And the reason that I brought it up earlier, that Goodwin had been a postdoc with another researcher in the department, was their work was relatively similar. They were both working with C. elegans, and they were working in different development pathways for C. elegans. And that professor did not take a single one of the 6 students, which I find pretty appalling. For someone to have such similar research and not be willing to help these students that were really just trying to do the best that they could and be as honest as they could too. So this led to some very interesting discussions between me and some other graduate students. So when we were talking about this, we are thinking about steps to and considering for whistleblowing. So you really need to review your concern with someone you trust. You got to listen to what that person tells you. Get a second opinion and take that seriously too. If you decide to initiate formal proceedings, seek strength in numbers, find the right place to file charges, study the procedures, report your concerns, ask questions, keep notes, and cultivate patience. So the reason why I think this is so important is this is not an abstract concept. This actually happened at CSU about 2 years ago to a professor in the chemistry department. And so this hits really, really close to home. This is not completely out of nowhere. So I think it's something that we all need to consider and make sure that we stand up for what we believe and be able to back it up. Another example that I have is actually one of my really good friends who is also a graduate student, had a very similar issue with her PI. And when she brought it up to certain people at the university, they discouraged her from pursuing it simply for the fact that it could potentially damage her future career if she was known as a whistleblower. I'm not saying that you shouldn't report stuff, but there is a lot of things to consider, especially in looking at how these graduate students ended up afterwards. So overall, was it worth it? Um, so Sarah was basically saying, are we just stupid to turn her in? Sure, it's the right thing to do, but right for who? Who is going to benefit from this? Nobody. Obviously, you know, four of them ended up not getting their PhDs, and two of them had to restart completely. So for the graduate students, this was just a sucky situation all around. And then from the scientists, the ones who come forward, admits ORI's John Dingley, often suffer a loss of time, loss of prestige, and a loss of credibility in your publications. And this is very similar to what I was just telling you about my friend that had a very similar uh, thing happen to her. Okay, so if you want to go and look at some of these different articles that came out about this, these are some references that I have for you. And then at this point, I will go ahead and open it up so that we can head into the discussion board and ask any questions that you would like.